I have got the honor of doing the first talk in this debate. And I have two quotes on this, and I'm starting with one quote from an old person, Shakespeare, who said, "Talking isn't doing. It is a kind of good deed to say well, and yet words are not deeds." So I'm going to talk in support of the motion that it is indeed the responsibility of researchers and research funding organizations to ensure that there is access to and support for the use of HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis as the standard of care for all participants at risk of HIV infection in HIV prevention clinical trials. And I'm supporting this debate. So where do we start? Well, what is the overarching aim of HIV prevention studies? It's to prevent new infections through the development of new technologies and interventions. That's why we do these HIV prevention studies. So if we care about prevention and being exemplars of doing prevention well, we should do prevention. I should probably stop the whole debate with that sentence. We cannot do research into this if we do not then implement what we know to work. And indeed, we do now know that PrEP works for women and men, that it's licensed for use in many of our countries where these studies are being done, and it's being rolled out in limited fashions in others. What we don't know in many of our studies is whether the study products that we're looking at actually work. And still in some of our studies, we have placebo given, which means that we certainly know that that person will not be protected. Therefore, knowing all of this, I would argue strongly that it is an ethical and a professional obligation that we provide our study participants with the best standard of prevention available. Have we always done this? Yes, we have. We've forgotten. But we've always introduced new technologies into the standard of prevention and into clinical trials, sometimes when it's not been widely available. And two examples I've given here is introducing female condoms and referring for voluntary medical male circumcision. So here are the arguments. If we offer PrEP, won't prevention studies for new and potentially more effective prevention technologies become impossible to implement, just too big and without endpoints because we'll stop the endpoints? Well, the first thing is that study sites will offer and ensure access to PrEP, but they can't force and won't be asked to force anybody in that study to take PrEP. And that means, and we know this, that some people will choose to use it, as they do in communities, and some will not, and some will adhere, and some will not. And we will never get 100% even in a clinical trial setting. And sadly, that means that we will continue to see HIV incidents in our clinical trials. The other thing to remember, though, is that you can pre-design a study and take into account the use of PrEP. And I'm going to give the example of ECHO, which is a study that we'll present the results of next year, looking at HIV incidence, comparing 3 commonly used contraceptives. It's not a classical prevention trial, but the endpoint is HIV seroconversion for women using 3 contraceptives. And in that study, we designed the protocol so that we could insert PrEP into the protocol at any time. And indeed now we are rolling out PrEP in all of the sites, and I'll come back to that. Arguably, and I think this is important to remember, that anything that's new in the prevention arena that we now introduce will indeed be done against the backdrop of PrEP. So isn't it better to figure out how we synergize and what the interactions are as we introduce PrEP now, sooner rather than later? So the next thing is, isn't this going to put up costs? And costs are already shocking, and we know this. These studies are expensive. From the ECHO study, let me give you the example. This is a 7,800-woman study, 12 sites in 4 countries in our region. The overall cost of this study is $50 million plus or minus. In the South African sites now, and in fact, we're introducing PrEP in all the sites, but I'm giving this example of cost. We're using a generic Truvada called Tenamine, which is $7 a bottle compared to between $34 and $50 a bottle. It is not expensive. Study staff can provide PrEP. You don't need to employ new people. We've trained all our staff to introduce PrEP quite successfully. So, do the maths. Adding PrEP is not going to put a massive increase in the budgets here at all. It's going to be a very small, integrated contribution to the budget. So then people will say, isn't it unethical to offer something in a study that won't necessarily be available after the study closes? So what is the argument to that? I would say no. Participants in HIV prevention trials are there because they're at high risk. And it is actually would be unethical not to offer them PrEP. It is ethical to offer them PrEP, because even that small window, it might be 2 or 3 years in a study, that might be a life-changing moment for them. And if we can protect them, even in that trial context, we should do that. And in addition, we now know, and many of you are aware of this, that many countries in the region are now rolling out PrEP, either with demonstration projects or parts of national programs, often targeting key populations. So by the time we finish studies now, there's a very good chance that we will be able to refer into sites. And that's what we're planning to do with ECHO. And finally, if you think about it, in many of our settings, PrEP is new, but we have a lot of clinical trial sites. If we actually roll out PrEP in the context of these clinical trial sites, we become a vanguard. We can actually be an advocate. The participants become advocates. The providers become advocates. We are training providers with new materials and developing new materials, and we're doing it with our health departments. So this actually is an opportunity to become and promote and become the advocates for PrEP and promote what we want to do. So with that, I'm going to leave you with the last quote. This is my colleague Nellie Mugo, who spoke earlier today. And this is what she said. I asked some friends and colleagues about what did they think. And she said, how will history judge scientists who don't find a way of offering PrEP? Thank you very much.